In Northern Ireland's Londonderry, better known as Derry, clashes with authority were nothing unusual. After decades of struggling for civil rights, residents had become familiar with rubber bullets and tear gas, particularly in the area known as the Bogside. But on this Sunday in 1972, what began as a peaceful march ended in a bloody massacre. British soldiers stormed the area, racing through the streets in armored tanks, sending people diving for cover. Armed with high-powered rifles, they opened fire on civilians, shooting at people as they fled or lay wounded, even as they tried to crawl to safety. They fired indiscriminately at women, children, elderly men, shooting people in the back and as they waved white handkerchiefs for mercy.
So if you're being fired at, you return fire, and they know that perfectly well.
How many gunmen do you feel you've hit in the Bogside?
Well, I'm told from my quick-sit rep, and you must understand it's a very quick-sit rep, that 3 gunmen were hit. We have not got the weapons, but this is the usual thing. We saw people come forward. I'm not going to say that I saw weapons taken away, because I don't know yet. I have not spoken to the men on the ground.
The surprise attack exacted a heavy toll.
Appearing to be dead, there are the 3 in that Saracen car. There are 2 men lying at the end of this block of flats. There's another man at least very close to being dead. There are 2 others up there. I'm told that there are some more in these flats here that I haven't seen yet. I would say there are probably about 4 dead at this moment. I don't know what those are doing, whether they're alive or dead, but they seem to be very dead, and they're thrown in as if they were dead meat.
British soldiers said they had been attacked with gunfire and nail bombs. The only bullets recovered, however, were those fired by British military, and none of their soldiers were wounded. "14 male civilians were killed. Of these, 7 were teenagers. Many more men, women, and children were injured. No one was armed. The Troubles in Northern Ireland stemmed from a long-running conflict. On one side, unionists and loyalists, mainly Protestant and pro-British rule. On the other, the nationalists, Catholic and pro-independence. The Catholic minority suffered major discrimination at the hands of the pro-British police and the British Army. Politically, voting rights, housing and jobs were heavily in favour of the Loyalists. In 1971, as a result of political unrest, the British government introduced internment, imprisonment without trial, under which the nationalist Catholics mainly suffered. The government followed this with a ban on all marches and parades. The Bogside in Derry had always been a hotbed of unrest, but at a mainly grassroots local level. Organised groups like the IRA had little hold here. With only stones as weapons, civilians were up against the might of the British Army, with its rubber bullets, water cannons and tear gas. In the capital city of Belfast, nationalist anger was taking an increasingly serious and highly organised form. Surprise bomb attacks rocked the city's streets, randomly snatching innocent lives. A veil of blood, fear and suspicion cloaked Northern Ireland and would not lift for decades. It was a fact that Bogsiders loved a march, a social gathering and community event as much as a political statement. On this particular Sunday, several thousand people set off, making their way through the streets in high spirits. At the army barricade, most of the crowd moved away, heading to a town meeting. A couple of hundred remained, mainly teenagers, shouting and hurling stones at the British Army, as was by now pretty well customary. The army responded in the usual way. Cannons sprayed purple-colored water onto protesters, and troops began firing the painful but not generally lethal rubber bullets. Once the inevitable tear gas came out, the crowd began to disperse, and the protest was virtually over. By this time, a report had allegedly been received of an IRA gunman in the area. Soldiers had already taken up tactical positions in derelict buildings around the densely populated area of Rossville Flats. Troops were given permission to use live ammunition. Away from the riot, the first shootings began, injuring a 15-year-old boy and fatally wounding a 59-year-old man. Some minutes later, the paratroopers moved in to begin making arrests. The shooting began in earnest.
Do not fire back for the moment, unless you identify positive targets.
Despite an order to cease fire, troops continued shooting at the backs of civilians as they fled in terror. One 17-year-old boy killed as he ran alongside the Catholic priest. The attack was without warning. The victims were taken completely by surprise.
Check it out. What? Well, I suppose large, 5 is quite large in these circumstances. It's unfortunate. But when we got up there, past William Street here where we're standing, and up towards Rossville Flats, we came under fire. We came under fire from the bottom of the flats, from the flats. We were also petrol bombed, and some acid, in fact, was poured on us from the top of the flats.
Local people are saying that you used excessive force when you went in there.
Well, what is force? If you're being fired at, you return fire, and they know that perfectly well.
How many gunmen do you feel you've hit in the Bogside?
Well, I'm told from my quick sit rep, you must understand it's a very quick sit rep, that 3 gunmen were hit. We have not got the weapons, but this is the usual thing. We saw people come forward. I'm not going to say that I saw weapons taken away, because I don't know yet. I have not spoken to the men on the ground, although I was forward when the shooting was going on.
You have no worries about this action?
None at all.
Local people have also said that you were disrespectful, or your troops were disrespectful and flung around the bodies of dead Bogsiders.
Well, I'm sure we did not. In fact, I was there when those bodies were recovered, and I ordered, in fact, the vehicle to go forward to pick them up. We did not know at that stage whether they were dead or whether they were wounded. And a vehicle went forward under the very real threat of fire, because we were still being fired at that stage.
How do you feel about today's operation in the Bogside?
Well, I think any of these sort of operations are unfortunate. We shouldn't have to do it, but they put us in a position where we can do no other. When we're fired at, we must protect ourselves.
No civilian guns were found. Nail bombs in the pockets of one dead teenager were later shown to have been planted while he was in military custody. Three days after the shootings, more than 20,000 people gathered outside St. Mary's Church for the funerals of the victims. Inside the packed church, the Mass was celebrated by the Bishop of Londonderry, who appealed for constraint and peace. Of the many mourners inside the church, 500 were relatives of the victims. After the service, the primate of all Ireland, Cardinal Conway, led a procession for peace, a dignified, sombre conclusion to a violent episode in Irish history. 2 days after Bloody Sunday, the British Parliament approved the establishment of an investigative tribunal, and the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Widgery, was appointed to the task. The brief from Prime Minister Edward Heath included the desire for an early result, and it was, delivered just 11 weeks after the event, and considered by many as scant in its scope. Forensic and ballistic test results were inadequately explored, plausible theories were untested, and credible eyewitnesses ignored.
I was a doctor who had seen the first 2 people who were shot at the scene, and then I'd pronounced 4 people dead on the scene. And I wrote a detailed submission to Widgery, and I was told that my evidence would not be required. Now, if that was a murder case in the streets, and I was a doctor and pronounced the person dead in the street, if I didn't want to go to the case, I'd have been subpoenaed and I'd been dragged into court. And I just couldn't believe it.
The report backed the British Army line, despite conflicting testimony, and adopted the rather naive logic that the soldiers wouldn't have fired first. Surely this was what the inquiry was all about.
Some of them may have actually received a bullet, which they should not have received, because of the situation, but they weren't deliberately gunned down. They were only deliberately gunned down if the soldiers thought, in fact, they in fact had firearms. Now, I still have to go along until someone can prove it otherwise, that my soldiers behaved in accordance with the very, very best standards of keeping the peace.
In a their word, our word scenario, their word ran second. Post-Bloody Sunday and the Widgery inquiry, the situation rapidly deteriorated. The Provisional IRA, a breakaway group, launched a campaign of violence. A series of lethal bomb blasts created terror in Belfast on what would become notorious as Bloody Friday. The violence continued for decades. In 1984, the Provisional IRA attempted unsuccessfully to assassinate British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet. The huge bomb blast caused many deaths and injuries. The following year, Mrs. Thatcher signed an historic agreement with the Republic of Ireland's Prime Minister, Dr. Garret Fitzgerald. This agreement, which gave Dublin a permanent voice in Northern Ireland's government, angered the Unionists. It was, however, a significant step towards ending the unrest and violence that had plagued Northern Ireland for so long, paving the way for a unified Ireland. During 1993 and 94, efforts by both Britain and Northern Ireland to move towards a peace process began gaining ground. In April 1994, the Provisional IRA called a 3-day ceasefire, and its political ally, the Sinn Féin, under leader Gerry Adams, worked with others towards an extended ceasefire. This became effective from the 1st of September.
I think that everybody is quite clear in their own minds now that it is for real a permanent cessation of violence, a complete cessation of violence. The war is over.
But the Provisional IRA was only one organisation. There were many others far less interested in peace. Fighting continued between nationalists and loyalists, with heavy losses on both sides. A national forum for peace and reconciliation was held in Dublin and was well attended, although boycotted by unionists. Gerry Adams called on the absent unionists to join in the peace movement and help shape the future of Northern Ireland. Soon after, Britain and Ireland released a plan to share in Northern Ireland's politics, enabling closer ties with Ireland.
We seek to help peace, but we are very well aware that only the people of Northern Ireland are able to deliver that peace. These are our ideas that I present this morning, but the future's up to you.
I join with the Prime Minister in appealing to all the parties concerned to grasp this opportunity.
The Irish question was not one just for those immediately affected, but for the whole world. In late 1995, Bill Clinton became the first US president to visit Northern Ireland.
You must stand firm against terror. You must say to those who still would use violence for political objectives, you are the past. Your day is over. Violence has no place at the table of democracy and no role in the future of this land.
In Dublin and Derry, thousands of people lined the streets to welcome President Clinton. Standing alongside one another, unionists and nationalists forgot their enmity as Clinton urged them to work together to end violence and injustice. After months of preparation, peace talks were set to begin, involving all parties, including the unionists. But IRA violence had erupted again, and Sinn Féin was excluded from the talks. Outside, Gerry Adams and Sinn Féin members were turned away. Inside, unionists derailed the talks by rejecting the chairman. The peace process still had a long way to go. It was now more than a year later. England had a new Prime Minister, and the violence had continued on both sides. Finally, the IRA announced a renewal of the ceasefire, but unionists in particular were sceptical.
I think the unionists should face forward, be forward-thinking and forward-looking, and build upon this momentous decision.
Northern Ireland's Secretary of State took the ceasefire as genuine. Sinn Féin was conditionally accepted into new talks and negotiation with all parties.
Now, we can always dwell on history, we can always look in the past and see what has happened. We've got to understand that past. We've got to make sure we know and learn lessons from it, but my goodness, we don't have to live in it. And what today is about is trying to move that process forward.
We will enter the negotiations seeking fundamental constitutional and political change, equality for all our citizens, and the complete demilitarisation of the situation.
Sinn Féin agreed to the conditions of joining the talks, completely renouncing the use of violence and pledging to use only peaceful means.
We're Irish Republicans. We want to see an end to British jurisdiction. Others have another view, so we are wedded to a democratic peace settlement, and we want to hear the views of others.
Perhaps not surprising, some were not convinced that things would change.
We have removed ourselves from the talks process today. We're not prepared to take part in a sham because we don't trust Sinn Féin, we don't trust the IRA.
Clinton appointee George Mitchell chaired the proceedings.
I believe the prospects today are better than they have been at any time since I have been involved in Northern Ireland, and that is a period of approximately 2.5 years.
The various parties reached agreement on Good Friday, but peace was short-lived. A breakaway group, calling itself the Real IRA, detonated what was the most destructive bomb in the violent history of Northern Ireland. 29 people were killed and over 200 injured. The attack killed Protestants, Catholics, children, adults, locals, and tourists. In an affirmation of peace, Catholic mourners welcomed into their midst longtime Unionist leader and Northern Ireland's First Minister, David Trimble.
I hope it means that we've seen a complete and final end to their violence. I think it means that the popular reaction to the Omagh atrocity means that they've come to their senses.
I think this is the end, and this is the final chapter. And just as the people who pushed the button on the Omagh bomb, I think just as they pushed that button, I think they also pushed the button of self-destruct.
In 1998, British Prime Minister Tony Blair announced a second Bloody Sunday inquiry, chaired by Lord Mark Saville. The 12-year-long inquiry heard testimony from more than 900 witnesses. It's the biggest and most expensive investigation in British legal history. And with allegations that the military and government of the day covered up the truth, it could well prove to be the most politically damaging in recent British history. For many, it's been a long and painful journey.
It was worth it for me because I was able to see the soldier in London. The soldier shot me. No, he's been branding me for 30 odd years as a nail bomber. But when he was up giving his evidence, I was sitting straight across him, and the man hadn't even the guts to come up to look at me.
I feel betrayed by the British government. I feel the army's being betrayed by the British government.
That man never flinched. He never showed any remorse for what he had done. That to me has been the strangest day probably of my life. But I feel that I do take some comfort that I, along with all the other relatives, have been part of putting that man in that chair.
I was informed at the inquiry that the IRA are targeting especially ex-1 para members, but any ex-para. I'm now carrying a personal protection weapon. My basic life lives in where I live. 90% of my life spent at home.
I have great doubts if they'll ever be satisfied with any inquiry. I'm sorry I have to say that, but I live in Ireland and I know how these people tick. And I doubt if they will therefore get a conclusion that they will say we accept this decision.